She saw her son confide in a poor worker, but she didn't know that this moment would turn her whole life upside down. Look what her choice led to. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The house stood at the edge of the city, grand and solemn, its tall windows glimmering under the early light of morning. Its marble steps, polished banisters, and expansive gardens told a story of wealth and permanence, of a life built to be admired from a distance. Inside, silence carried through the wide corridors, broken only by the muffled hum of servants tending to their chores. The mistress of this house had long grown used to this silence. It filled her days as much as the scent of fresh flowers in every vase and the faint ticking of antique clocks that lined the walls. She lived in a world of curated beauty, yet she felt an absence at the core of it, a hollow space no amount of refinement could conceal. She had everything she was supposed to have. Clothes from the finest designers hung in her closet. Her walls were decorated with oil paintings collected on travels, and her driveway often filled with polished cars that brought guests to lavish dinners. Yet she often wondered why none of these things managed to warm her heart. Each event in her calendar, every social encounter, felt rehearsed. The conversations were about stocks, about fashion trends, about whose child was accepted into which prestigious school. Everyone smiled, but every smile seemed sharpened with competition or envy. For her, the grandeur had become an empty routine, a stage where she played her role flawlessly but without conviction. Her son lived within the same walls but felt like he belonged to another world entirely. He was 10 years old, a boy with intelligent eyes but a withdrawn expression, a child raised more by tutors and nannies than by his own mother. She told herself it was necessary, that she was giving him the best, surrounding him with skilled instructors, ensuring his life would be paved with success. Yet she knew, deep down, that she had distanced herself too much, that their moments together were brief and formal, lacking the closeness she secretly longed for. He obeyed her, but never truly opened his heart, and she accepted it as one more unspoken wound in her otherwise immaculate existence. That morning she stood by the wide window of her study, sipping tea from a delicate porcelain cup. From where she stood, she could see part of the garden, the fountain in the center, the long path lined with rose bushes, and the metal bar her late husband had once installed at the edge of the yard for exercise. She had forgotten it was even there. The sight that met her eyes, however, was not one of idle beauty, but of motion and effort. Her son was at the bar, struggling to lift his small body upward, his arms trembling with strain. And beside him stood a man she had only seen in passing, a worker she had hired to handle repairs on the property, someone who usually kept to himself, hammering, lifting, painting. He was dressed simply, a faded shirt clinging to broad shoulders, his jeans marked with stains from years of labor. His hands, darkened by sun and work, held lightly at the boy's waist, guiding him upward with patience, offering just enough support for the child to believe he was doing it on his own. She narrowed her eyes, surprised. Her son was laughing. It was not a sound she often heard, not like this light, unrestrained, bubbling with energy. She realized she had never seen him so eager with the expensive trainers she had hired, men who barked instructions with cold efficiency. Yet here he was, straining, laughing, trying again and again, while this man counted steadily, nodding encouragement, his calm presence grounding the child in a way she could not explain. She told herself she was simply curious, that this moment was nothing more than a coincidence she happened to witness. Still, she did not move away from the window. She lingered, watching as the boy tried again, his face flushed, his lips pressed in determination. The man corrected his grip, demonstrated emotion with his own arms, then gestured for the boy to try. There was no performance in his actions, no attempt to impress anyone, only a steady, genuine focus on helping the child grow stronger. The woman felt a strange stirring in her chest. It was not yet directed at the man, not yet colored with any thought she could name, but something about the scene unsettled her. It was too real, too alive to belong in the carefully polished world she had built around herself. Her son's laughter, his flushed cheeks, the sparkle in his eyes, these things pierced through the layers of formality and wealth, like sunlight breaking through shutters. She touched her fingers lightly to the window pane, as if trying to hold on to the image a moment longer. Later, as she walked through the halls of her home, she tried to shake the feeling. She reminded herself of the luncheon she was to attend, the calls she needed to make, the image she was expected to maintain. Yet her thoughts returned again and again to the sight of her son clinging to that bar, lifted by his own effort in the quiet support of the man beside him. She remembered the small tilt of his shoulders, the easy patience in his stance. It contrasted so sharply with the restless arrogance of the men she usually encountered. That evening, as the house quieted, she found herself replaying the scene in her mind. She thought of the boy's laughter and realized she had not been the one to bring it out. She thought of the worker's presence, so unassuming yet so effective, and wondered why she, with all her resources, had never managed to achieve the same result. The image refused to fade, and she carried it with her into the night, unsettled by the realization that perhaps something in her life had been missing all along. The following days passed in a blur of obligations, yet her mind remained fixed on the yard. Each time she heard the faint sounds of effort and laughter drifting through her windows, her heart moved with a restlessness she could not name. She began to notice things she had overlooked before: the way the worker carried himself, the way he lingered to ensure tasks were done properly, the way he never demanded attention. She told herself it was because of her son, because she wanted to encourage the boy's newfound enthusiasm. But even as she repeated this reasoning, she knew it was not the whole truth. Her life of marble staircases and glittering chandeliers had suddenly been interrupted by the sight of something far more ordinary and far more profound. She began to sense that what she had glimpsed that morning was not just her son's triumph, but the quiet opening of a door she had never dared to consider. Behind it lay something unpolished, perhaps even unbecoming in the eyes of her peers, but it glowed with a kind of authenticity she had long forgotten could exist. And so, without realizing it, she began to wait for the next morning, for the next moment by the window, where she might catch again the sound of her child's laughter and the presence of the man who had brought it forth. The house, for all its grandeur, seemed a little less complete now that she had seen what was possible beyond its walls. She walked through its corridors differently, her heels clicking against polished floors, her gaze drifting toward the garden more often than before. Something had shifted inside her, something small but undeniable, and though she could not yet name it, she felt the weight of it pressing gently, insistently upon her heart. The days that followed seemed to carry a rhythm she had not known before. The great house, with its endless rooms and polished silence, was no longer the center of her attention. Her gaze, almost against her will, drifted again and again toward the garden, where the sound of her son's laughter had returned, filling the air with a life she had missed for so long. It was not the laughter of politeness or of being entertained by expensive toys, but the laughter of effort, of discovery, of a boy learning to test his own strength. Each morning she found herself lingering near the tall windows or stepping outside under the pretense of tending to the roses. In truth, she was drawn by the same magnetic pull, the sight of her child and the man who guided him. Her son had changed in subtle ways. Where once he moved sluggishly through the halls, uninterested in lessons and quick to retreat into silence, he now carried himself with a trace of energy she had not thought possible. At meals he spoke more, telling fragments of what he had done in the yard. And though his words were often simple, they were filled with pride. He told her how many times he had pulled himself up, how much higher he had climbed, how much stronger he felt. And when he spoke, his eyes brightened in a way that made her heart ache with both joy and regret. She realized then how much she had longed for these small moments of closeness, how empty their lives had been without them. The man himself remained quiet, almost reluctant to draw notice. He arrived at the house with the steady pace of one accustomed to work, carrying tools in an old bag, his clothes worn but clean. He did not linger where he was not needed, nor did he ever seek to approach her. His attention belonged to the tasks at hand, and increasingly, to the boy who followed him eagerly. It was through her son that she saw him most clearly, through the way the child watched him with admiration and trust, through the way his own small frame seemed to grow sturdier under the man's patient instruction. At first, she told herself that her interest was only maternal. She wanted to encourage her son's progress, wanted to be near when he practiced, wanted to witness his newfound enthusiasm. But she knew as the days slipped into weeks that it was more than that. Her eyes lingered too long on the man's movements, on the way his shoulders bent as he lifted heavy planks, on the surety with which his hands gripped the bar to demonstrate emotion. There was no arrogance in him, no pretension, only the quiet competence of someone who knew how to use his strength without waste. She found herself noticing the calm steadiness in his expression, the way his brow furrowed, not in annoyance, but in concentration, the way he corrected her son with patience instead of impatience. The contrast struck her deeply. In the circle of wealth where she had lived all her life, men carried themselves with polish, but also with sharpness. Their gestures meant to impress, their words meant to dominate. They were creatures of status, quick to measure themselves against others, eager to win admiration. Her former husband had been the epitome of such a man, tall, refined, successful, yet cold and calculating, his heart bound to ambition more than to family. Around men like him, she had learned to dress perfectly, to speak carefully, to present herself as the polished wife who knew her place in the theater of wealth. But around this worker, there was no stage. His presence did not demand performance. He seemed almost unaware of the effect he had, intent only on the immediate world of labor and the small boy who shadowed his steps. She began to realize how much she craved that simplicity. She found herself inventing reasons to step into the garden more often, checking on the gardeners, inspecting the flower beds, pretending to look for faults in the stone path. In truth, her gaze always drifted to where her son clung to the bar and the man stood nearby. Sometimes she lingered at a distance, pretending to admire a rose bush, while every fiber of her being was tuned to the sound of their voices, the rhythm of encouragement and effort. At other times, she allowed herself to sit on the terrace with a book she never opened, pretending to read while her eyes lifted again and again toward the yard. The more she watched, the more she felt the stirring of something she could not dismiss. It was not only gratitude, though she was grateful that her son had found in this man a guide she herself had failed to provide. It was not only admiration, though she admired his patience, his skill, his quiet dignity. It was something deeper, something that unsettled her. She realized she was waiting for him, that her days seemed dull until he appeared in the garden, that her heart leapt slightly each time she caught sight of him through the window. She told herself it was harmless, a fleeting curiosity, but the lie sat heavily upon her. Her son, oblivious to the storm growing inside her, grew more animated each day. He began to tell her things at dinner, simple stories of how the worker had shown him a new way to climb, how he had managed to hold himself up for longer, how strong he was becoming. He spoke with such pride that it startled her, for she had never heard him speak with such fire before. And in his words, she sensed not only the boy's pride, but also the bond he had formed with the man. That bond, though innocent, stirred something complicated within her. She felt a pang of envy that it was not she who drew out such joy, but at the same time, she felt a rush of gratitude toward the one who had given it. Nights became restless. She found herself replaying the scenes in her mind, the boy's laughter, the man's calm instructions, the ease with which he carried himself in her garden. She wondered what kind of life he returned to when he left the house at dusk, wondered what sort of home awaited him, wondered if there was someone else who shared his quiet strength. She had never asked about his life, had never even considered that such curiosity could matter. But now the questions pressed upon her mind with insistent weight. Her own life, filled with glittering parties and polished facades, felt suddenly fragile and hollow in comparison. She thought of the dinners where she sat among people who smiled with their lips, but not their eyes, where every compliment was edged with rivalry, where every gesture was measured. How different it was from the raw honesty of the yard, where a boy struggled to pull himself upward and a man steadied him without need for praise. She began to feel as though she herself were that child, clinging to a bar of expectations, lifted only by the strength of appearances, while her soul longed for a hand that would steady her without judgment. The weeks unfolded with this quiet tension. She continued to move between her two worlds, the gleaming world of wealth, where she played her role with practiced grace, and the unpolished world that existed just beyond her window, where her heart seemed to awaken. The two worlds touched but never merged, separated by the invisible boundary of class, by the rules she had been taught since childhood. Yet each day, as she watched the bond grow between her son and the man, she felt herself drawn further into that forbidden space, pulled by a force she could neither resist nor fully understand. And so, the house remained as splendid as ever, its rooms filled with silence, its corridors echoing with refinement. But for her, the center of life had shifted. It was no longer the grand dining room or the glittering chandeliers, but the simple corner of the yard where strength was measured not by wealth or status, but by the quiet patience of a man who had nothing to prove, and the laughter of a boy who finally felt alive. The change in her days did not go unnoticed for long. What had begun as a private indulgence, her quiet watching from the terrace or window, gradually became a rhythm woven into the household. The servants, discreet though they tried to be, could not help but sense her new attentiveness. They saw the way she lingered in the garden when before she would have hurried back indoors, the way her eyes followed not only her son, but the man who guided him. Whispers began in the corners of the house, not spoken to her directly but carried in the subtle glances exchanged between maids and gardeners. She pretended not to notice, but the knowledge sat heavily within her, as though the walls themselves had grown eyes that judged her every movement. It was not long before the wider circle of her life began to comment as well. At a luncheon with old acquaintances, one woman, lips painted in a smile too sharp to be kind, remarked on how much time she had been spending at home lately. Another, swirling wine in her glass, asked whether the repairs to her estate were still dragging on, for she had heard a worker was practically living there now. The words were veiled, but the meaning was not. They were probing, testing, circling around the suspicion that something unusual was taking place behind the gates of her mansion. She laughed it off with the practiced ease of someone long accustomed to the games of the wealthy. But inside she felt the sting of their scorn. Her former husband was less delicate. At one of their strained encounters regarding custody and arrangements for their son, he looked at her with the disdain of a man who had once owned her presence and now found it sullied. He mocked the very idea that she allowed a common laborer so much access to their boy, sneering at the thought that she might think it beneficial. To him it was an embarrassment, a lowering of standards, proof that she had lost the careful judgment expected of her station. His words cut deep, not because she still cared for his opinion, but because they echoed the voices that had long shaped her life. Voices that told her what was proper, what was acceptable, what must never be crossed. At night, in the solitude of her room, she turned these judgments over in her mind. She tried to summon the cold certainty she had once lived by, the belief that status determined worth, that her place was among those of her kind, not beneath them. Yet the memory of the garden, of her son's laughter, of the man's quiet strength, rose again and again to undo her resolve. She found herself caught between two selves, the woman she had been trained to be, polished and controlled, and the woman who longed for something unrefined and honest. The struggle wore at her, leaving her restless and uncertain, as though she were standing at a crossroads no one else could see. The man himself remained unchanged, and perhaps it was this constancy that made her conflict sharper. He did not seek her attention, did not cross the invisible line that separated their lives. When he passed her in the garden, he acknowledged her presence with a respectful nod, but did not linger. His focus was always on the boy, on the work at hand, and yet she could not help but study him more closely, to let her eyes follow the movements of his arms, the lines of his face, the quiet steadiness that seemed to radiate from him. In his simplicity, there was no shame, no need to measure himself against the world. He simply was. That quality, so rare in her own circles, unsettled her precisely because it was so pure. Her upbringing rose against her with renewed force. She remembered her mother's voice, stern and exacting, drilling into her from girlhood that appearances were everything, that wealth was not only comfort, but identity, that to step beneath it was to invite ruin. She recalled lessons about posture, about speech, about how to accept compliments with grace while never forgetting one's superiority. Those lessons had shaped every choice she had made, every smile she had worn, every silence she had endured. And now, as she found herself drawn toward a man who embodied none of those values, she felt as though she were betraying not only her family, but the very foundation of her existence. Her son's bond with the man only deepened her turmoil. The boy trusted him with an ease that pierced her heart, spoke to him freely in ways he rarely spoke to her. She began to realize that what she envied was not only the man's presence, but the closeness her child had found in him. It made her question what kind of mother she had been, whether all her efforts to provide the best tutors and the finest opportunities had in fact starved her son of the very thing he most needed: simple human connection. That realization was both humbling and painful, and it made her gratitude toward the man more complicated still. It was during one of her rare conversations with him, brief and almost accidental, that she glimpsed a fragment of his past. He had been repairing the gate when she approached, intending only to inspect the work, but he mentioned, almost without thought, that he had learned to mend such things as a boy, out of necessity. The words lingered in her mind. Out of necessity. She imagined a childhood starkly unlike her son's, a boy who worked instead of playing, who carried burdens instead of toys. Later, through quiet inquiries, she learned more: that he had grown up poor, that he had supported his family since he was barely old enough to hold a tool, that his life had been marked by hardship. There were even whispers of darker times, debts, perhaps a fight that had gone too far, maybe even a short sentence served. She did not know which details were true, but what struck her was not the stain of them, but the way he bore them. He carried no shame, spoke no falsehoods, wore his life as it was, neither polished nor excused. The knowledge unsettled her. In the world she had always known, flaws were hidden, sins were disguised, masks were worn so tightly that one could hardly breathe. But here was a man who had lived through hardship without disguise, whose past was not spotless, yet whose presence was steady and whole. She found herself wondering if that was why he could guide her son with such patience. Because he knew struggle, because he had faced it, because he understood what it meant to fight against limitations. The thought made her chest tighten with something between admiration and longing, and so her nights grew heavier, filled with questions she could not answer. Could she step across the boundary that divided them? Could she endure the scorn of her peers, the disdain of her former husband, the whispers that already swirled around her name? Could she abandon the teachings of a lifetime, the rules that had been carved into her since girlhood? Each time she asked, she told herself no. And yet, each morning, when she heard her son's laughter drifting through the garden, she felt the answer shift towards something far more dangerous. The house itself seemed to press upon her, its polished surfaces mocking her indecision. The chandeliers, the marble, the velvet drapes, all the symbols of her status, now appeared as fragile ornaments, incapable of filling the emptiness she carried. The contrast between the cold grandeur inside and the warmth of life outside grew sharper with each passing day, until she felt she could hardly breathe within her own walls. She was a woman divided, torn between the world she had been given and the world her heart now sought, between the safety of appearances and the perilous truth of desire. By the end of that season, she knew she could not remain suspended forever. A choice loomed before her, though she dared not name it yet. The garden had become both her sanctuary and her trial, a place where her son thrived, where her heart awakened, and where the eyes of others threatened to strip her of dignity. She walked its paths with measured steps, her mind a storm of fear and yearning, and though she tried to tell herself that it was enough simply to watch, she knew it was not. Something was changing within her, something irreversible, and as the days shortened and the evenings cooled, she found herself standing more often at the threshold of that change, uncertain whether she would step forward or retreat. The barrier was still there, high and unyielding, but cracks had begun to show, and through those cracks came the possibility of a life she had never allowed herself to imagine, a life raw, imperfect, but achingly real. Autumn deepened around the estate, painting the garden in shades of copper and gold, softening the sharp edges of summer with the hush of fallen leaves. The air grew cooler, carrying with it the scent of earth and rain, And in those fading days, the woman felt the weight of her inner conflict pressing more heavily upon her. What had once been a quiet stirring had grown into something undeniable, a tide rising within her that refused to be contained by fear or silence. She could no longer pretend that what she felt was merely gratitude for the way the man had guided her son. It was more, and it lived in every glance, in every sound of laughter from the yard, in every fleeting moment when their eyes met. The whispers in society circles had become sharper, the comments more barbed. At dinners, she was met with smirks disguised as smiles, questions disguised as casual conversation. Everyone seemed to know or to suspect, though there was nothing concrete for them to seize. They did not need proof. Suspicion was enough to poison the air she breathed among them. Her former husband was relentless, seizing every opportunity to mock her choices, to declare her unfit, to remind her that her son's future must not be tainted by association with a man so far beneath their station. His words, though cruel, only revealed more clearly the emptiness of the life she had once believed in. At home, the conflict grew sharper still. She watched her son's progress with a mixture of pride and fear. He grew stronger under the workers' guidance, not only in body but in spirit. He carried himself with a confidence that had never been there before, a lightness in his step, a brightness in his eyes. Yet each time she saw the bond between them strengthen, she felt the truth pressing harder upon her heart. This was no longer only her son's story, it was hers as well. She had been pulled into something that demanded a decision, something that would not allow her to remain suspended between two worlds forever. At night, she walked the long corridors of her house, her footsteps echoing against marble floors, her reflection fractured in tall mirrors. The chandeliers glittered above her, indifferent to her turmoil, while the velvet drapes hung heavy, shutting out the world beyond. She realized with a pang that the house itself had become a prison. It was beautiful, yes, but its beauty was suffocating, binding her to a life that no longer felt like her own. Every polished surface seemed to whisper the expectations she had been raised with. Every gleaming corner, a reminder of the rules she was meant to follow. But when she closed her eyes, she saw only the garden, the laughter, the man who stood so firmly within himself. Her son became the mirror in which she saw her own desires reflected. The boy spoke of the man constantly, not in the reverent tones of a pupil toward a master, but with the warmth of one who had found a friend, a guide, a figure to look up to. It was innocence, and yet within it lay the seed of something greater, the proof that true connection could exist beyond wealth, beyond status, beyond the cold measures of society. And as she listened to her son, she realized that her own heart was demanding the same thing. Connection, truth, life unshackled by appearances. The man himself did nothing to sway her, and that made her longing more profound. He remained steady, respectful, never crossing the line that divided their worlds. He did not seek her attention, yet every gesture, every word he spoke to her son, every moment of quiet dignity became a call to her spirit. She found herself drawn to him, not because he pursued her, but because he did not. His distance made her choice more honest, for it was not seduction that guided her, but recognition. The recognition of something real in him that she could no longer deny. The day of reckoning came quietly, as such days often do. It was late afternoon, the sky pale with the approach of winter, when she stood at the edge of the garden, watching her son hang triumphantly from the bar, his arms trembling but his smile radiant. The man stood beside him, nodding encouragement, his expression calm. She watched them together, the child she had brought into the world and the man who had given him strength, and she knew in that instant that her life could no longer return to what it had been. A decision rose within her, unstoppable, urgent, born of weeks and months of silent struggle. She thought of the two paths before her. One was the path of safety, the path she had always walked, the world of wealth, of acceptance, of polished dinners and guarded smiles. It was the path of empty grandeur, of loneliness behind gilded walls, of a life lived according to others' rules. The other path was uncertain, perhaps even perilous, but it was alive. It was the path that led to the laughter of her son, to the quiet strength of the man who had brought him joy, to the possibility of a life unmeasured by appearances, but by truth. Her heart pounded as she realized she could no longer delay. The barrier that had held her back had already cracked beyond repair. The choice was not whether to remain or to leap, but whether she had the courage to face the world's judgment for the sake of her own soul. For the first time in her life, she felt the full weight of freedom pressing upon her. In one version of her future, she turned away. She returned to the house, to the glittering chandeliers and the polished silence, telling herself it was for her son's sake, for the preservation of dignity. She closed the garden gates and let the man walk away, never to return. In this version, she aged within her marble halls, respected perhaps, but hollow, forever haunted by the sound of laughter she had silenced. But in the truer version, the one her heart demanded, she stepped forward instead of back. She walked into the garden, her steps slow but resolute, and for the first time allowed herself to stand not as the mistress of the house, not as a figure of wealth, but as a woman. She met the man's gaze, and though he said nothing, the steadiness in his eyes was answer enough. Her son, breathless from effort, turned toward her with joy that lit his face, and in that light she saw the life she had been searching for. It was not perfect, not polished, but it was real, and she chose it. The house behind her still stood, grand and imposing, but its power over her had ended. Its walls could no longer bind her. Its silence could no longer command her. The choice she made was not without cost, but it was hers. For the first time in her life, she felt the weight of expectation lift, replaced by something far greater, the freedom to live truthfully, to love without measure, to allow her son to grow not in the shadow of wealth, but in the light of authenticity. And so, as the last leaves fell and the garden prepared for winter, she stepped into a new season of her life. The world would not understand. The whispers would not cease, but none of that mattered. She had chosen, and in her choice lay the promise of something stronger than status, more enduring than wealth. She had chosen life over appearance, truth over pretense, love over fear. And as she walked toward the laughter of her son and the quiet presence of the man who had brought it forth, she knew she had finally found what she had been searching for all along. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Watch our next video for another powerful journey and explore our other videos for more stories like this. And please, share this one with someone who needs to hear it.